Hi and hello, welcome back to In the Margins Notes on Faith and Becoming. I hope you're all doing well this Sunday evening. If you're watching on a Sunday or whenever you're watching, I hope you're doing well. If you're watching me on YouTube, guys, please, I bulk film, hence why I'm wearing the same clothes I wore in the first episode. I don't just have these two items of clothing in my wardrobe. Now that's out of the way. When I was thinking about the second episode to record, I really wanted to do an episode or a revisit of an episode I did with Josh as part of Evergreen, where we looked at the fear of visibility, the fear of being perceived. And I think this was a no-brainer to film, considering the fact that, as I mentioned before, if you were to watch my former videos with Josh, it looked like, especially in the first season, I was being held at gunpoint. And I think it's quite ironic that despite my discomfort, I am now sat here in front of you guys, now taking and driving forward this podcast on my own. And I think naturally it can make one think or wonder, what changed between that time when you first started and now you recording this podcast, you owning the podcast by yourself. And so I really want to explore how my relationship with fear has changed, and hopefully this is relatable to you guys who may struggle with the same fear, and how we can kind of overcome it, especially when we think about exercising and using our talents and our gifts. There's an element where you need to be visible. You have to be visible in order to use your talents and gifts. I don't really know anyone who's not visible. You're either marketing your skills or you're serving others. Like, there's an element of visibility. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. I think it's important to recognize that this hyper awareness of oneself doesn't typically start because of your time spent on social media, although it can do. But for a lot of us, it stems from childhood, where we've been taught to edit ourselves or to play it small or to not show up as our full and authentic self. And I know that's the case for me. In the original episode I recorded with Josh on this particular topic, I gave an anecdote of how when I was being bullied in school, there was a fence that I would hide behind so that my bullies wouldn't see me. I'd literally just spend lunch and break time hiding behind this fence just to ensure that they couldn't see me. And I think subconsciously I learned that if you make yourself physically small, you won't be a target of bullying, of harassment, of negative words. This particular picture is a metaphor for life, or what I've had to journey through as an adult, where the fence no longer becomes a physical fence, and the physical crouching behind this fence is no longer physical anymore, but it shows up in my behavior. So it may be that I'm not speaking up in environments and in rooms or in contexts where I should be speaking up. It shows up as me being, what's the word? Differential, is that the word? Where I will pass on responsibility to someone who I may, think is more, who I may assess as being more qualified, so that the limelight is not on me. I play it small by not bringing my full self and showing up with my full authentic opinions and my voice and my ideas, to ensure that I'm not a target for criticism or judgment or being perceived or whatever it is that I fear from other people. What I failed to explain in this episode is that how a coping mechanism or a survival strategy, I don't think sometimes we really reflect on how these things travel with us. Rarely do they ever remain contained in that particular moment in time. They travel with us, albeit they look different and they appear different as adults. Over time, as an adult, I think I began to recognize that what I deemed as playing small, I would excuse as being humble or as giving someone else an opportunity, when in actual fact it was me trying to protect myself, me trying to control a narrative about myself, especially as someone who has had the experience of being bullied, where the narrative about you is out of your control. I recognized that there was a deep desire within me and a deep need to control how people perceive me, and how that manifested was by not showing up as much as I should have, to ensure that people had no basis to ridicule me or to judge me. Now, what is so ironic is that in recent years, I've learned that giving people nothing still creates room for people to project something onto you, because now they're filling in the gap with their own ideas about you, their own projections about you, which is it's been quite an interesting thing to navigate. How sometimes we think that, not showing up enough, will do the job in terms of protecting us, when in actual fact it may work to do the reverse. So effectively, I think this whole fear of being perceived, fear of being visible, for me was an issue with, I think for me stemmed from the bullying and the fact that there is a deep need within me to control how people see me, how people perceive and even treat me, because I don't want to be ridiculed, because I don't want to be made fun of, because I don't want to be judged, because I don't want to be seen in a negative light. There's something deeply disturbing for me. I know for other people with the fear of perception and fear of visibility, there's an issue with being perceived, period, point blank. I don't think my issue is being necessarily being perceived or being visible. I think it's being misinterpreted. Another manifestation of this kind of fear of being perceived, this fear of showing up, has been the quiet label, and it's something I wanted to explore. As I've said, I'm an introvert to the core. I think I did a test recently and it was giving I think I'm 63% introverted. I'm a strong introvert, but I'm sociable. Reserved, yes, but I'm not shy. And I realized that because of my experiences, the quiet label that I had placed upon me as a child, the shy label placed upon me as a child, was not a character trait but an adaptation. It was a response to previous experiences, and as a result, to protect myself, I had become shy. I had become, withdrawn and reticent. And the unfortunate part is, when you adopt a behavior pattern, especially in childhood, over a period of time, when you continue exhibiting and practicing those characteristics, it seeps into your unconscious, where before you know it, you're actually performing shyness and being withdrawn and being quiet unconsciously, not because you want to, but because it's just become a repeated habit that you've done over and over and over and over again. And it's taken some time for me to really realize that I think I'm not a shy person. Yes, I may look at you sideways when I first meet you, and that's just because, as a person, I like to spend time observing people and just getting a feel for them before I, open up. But I'm not a shy person. And so I think it's just quite interesting to see how, in my case at least, how the fear of being perceived, which stemmed from bullying, pushed me into a identity that just did not reflect who I truly am and was. Sometimes what we call to be identity is actually not your identity. It's just a series of habits that have just seeped into your unconscious and have now produced the false self. Now, if you want to learn more about the false self, I highly recommend, I want to say it's Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Pete Scazzaro, who talks about not being your authentic self and just emotional health in general. When you are operating from your false self, you are your most unhealthy version of you, if that makes sense. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't explore the aspect of your voice when it comes to the fear of visibility and the fear of being perceived, because your voice is so inextricably tied up to your identity, your soul, your thoughts, your inner being, your most vulnerable parts. And if you don't feel safe to show up, by virtue, just naturally, you won't feel comfortable using your voice. Now, I know a lot of people, create content around how to find your voice and stuff like that, but I'm personally of the belief that everyone has a voice, and your most authentic voice is that voice that you had when you were 3 and 4 years old. When I was 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, I was a very confident child. I loved to speak in school assemblies. I loved to speak up. I loved it, like a typical Congolese child, in the limelight. Somewhere along the way, however, and I think this happens to a lot of us, we are told, we're too much, or we're not doing enough, or we're bullied, or we develop these insecurities along the way. And by the time we're, in our late teens, early 20s, whatever, into adulthood, we're now struggling to go back to our most authentic self and to unearth our most authentic voices. And I can really relate to this in that I had a friend say to me in secondary school, and she'd known me since I was in primary school. She'd known me since the age of 7, and went to the same secondary school together. And I think I was in year 9. She said to me, Ruth, like, you were never this quiet. Like, what happened? Like, you were never like this. And I think it's a good kind of example of how the issues, like, how life can really wear you down. It can really wear down your confidence. It can really wear down your resilience and your boldness to show up as your most authentic self and to use your voice as well. Your voice is such a sensitive thing, I think, because you're effectively articulating your inner world. And if someone misinterprets your inner world, if someone critiques your inner world, effectively they're critiquing a very intimate part of you, your soul, your convictions, your thoughts. It's almost like someone is rejecting your internal world, which you keep locked away. And in a particular moment of vulnerability, you share it, and it's immediately shut down with ridicule or sneering or whatever it may be. Hence why I think the fear of visibility and the fear of perception really stifles people from using their voices, because there's a fear that if I show up as my authentic self, and if you see my most authentic self articulated through my voice, my words, my speech, you're rejecting very vulnerable parts of me. You're rejecting my intellect, you're rejecting my emotions, you're rejecting, how I perceive the world, my experiences and my journey as well. So I think it's a really layered thing, this fear of visibility. It's not just, oh, I'm too scared to post a story on Instagram, but I think it also goes down to things like whether we have confidence to even use our voice. Now, I think I've been throwing this word around quite a bit, but I've not really hit the hammer on it. And I want to do this in this particular segment. So we've been speaking about the fear of visibility, fear of being perceived, but I think at its crux, we need to deal with fear itself, but specifically fear of man. Now, the Bible in Proverbs talks about how the fear of man is a snare. Like, it is literally a trap. A snare is a trap. Because once human perception, once human commentary begins to gain ground and territory in our lives and authority over our lives, it doesn't just affect how you feel, but also how you move. The people whose approval you most want can become the people whose opinions you most fear. And when that happens, you start making decisions based less on conviction and more on anticipated reaction. You speak when it seems safe. You stay silent when it seems risky. You obey selectively, and you present yourself strategically. And at some point, you have to ask whether what looks like caution is actually captivity. And I'll say that again. At some point, you have to ask yourself whether what looks like caution is actually captivity. Now, fear of man is powerful precisely because it can disguise itself as reasonableness. It can sound responsible. It can sound modest and humble. But it's still a trap fundamentally. And when I was preparing for this, there were kind of two stories that really struck with me for different reasons. But the first one I want to begin with is the story of King Saul and how the fear of man was his snare. This story, I know a lot of people like to say, when they read the story of David and Saul and whatever, that they are the David, and we often position ourselves as David, the one waiting, for our promotion, the one waiting for us to be recognized in our calling and all of that good stuff. But rarely do we ever situate ourselves, or do we draw parallels between ourselves and Saul. And Saul, unfortunately, is someone I can relate to. There's a particular Bible verse where it talks about how, I think it's Samuel, confronts Saul because of his disobedience, which stemmed from the fear of man. Because of what his army was saying, he disobeyed the commands of God. And Samuel confronts him and says to him, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel?" And that line is just it's so revealing, and it's just, I think it captures some of my inner thoughts sometimes. Like, though you see yourself as small in your own eyes, can you not see how gifted you are? Can you not see how talented you are? Can you not see how anointed you are? But because of your perception of yourself, it led you into rebellion because you feared the opinions of other people. For context, King Saul stood as the tallest in Israel, one of the most handsome men in Israel. Yet, because of his own self-perception, he was easily led astray. I can really relate to that, where it's like, but people may give me words about my calling, what I'm meant to do, something as simple as even the podcast. Like, it has been reiterated to me over and over and over and over again. You are a gifted communicator. You are called to communicate the heart and mind of God. However, because I don't see myself as the most competent, because I see myself as small in my own eyes, I do things that are just disobedient, like stalling to come back and return to the podcast, which by the grace of God I didn't do for too long. Like, I was quite quick with just, executing it. But there are instances where I should have spoken, but I didn't speak because I saw myself as small in my own eyes, and that's disobedience, and also disobedience being tied to rebellion. Saul's problem was not a lack of appointment, it wasn't a lack of calling, it wasn't even a lack of external stature. We know this. His problem was self-perception. And I think this is where I want to this is something I want to explore when it comes to the fear of visibility and the fear of being perceived. Sometimes we don't show up where we are called to show up because of how we perceive ourselves. So because I don't see myself as competent, because I don't see myself as attractive, because I don't see myself as intelligent or whatever, I'm all of those things. It means that I now walk in disobedience because I'm not convinced of what God has said about me. And so I do the opposite. I do what is right in my own sight. And I do the opposite, which is rebellion. Saul feared the people more than he feared God, and he compromised because the voice of the crowd had become weightier to him than the command of the Lord. And I think that's deeply sobering, because I think sometimes we see low self-esteem as something that is completely harmless and cute and innocent, but it is so costly. Being small in your own eyes, having low self-esteem can lead you into disobedience. It can lead you into rebellion, which we know as the sin of witchcraft. And there comes a point where what looks like insecurity is just rebellion, And that sounds strong, but I think it needs to sound strong for you to really get the message that insecurity can lead to rebellion. Low self-esteem, which we think is cute sometimes, especially in girls, can lead to disobedience. The point where chronic hesitation is no longer just a personality quirk. Me saying, oh my gosh, like, I'm so scared of the microphone, I'm so scared of the stage or whatever, it's no longer cute anymore. Like, this perpetual shrinking is no longer just how you are. There is a point where you have to really confront the fact that your self-perception is interfering with your willingness to obey God. And I mean, like, some of you guys watching are fully vaccinated adults, like full-blown, you got your tetanus shot, MMR shots, hair on your chest, like, you guys are full-blown adults. It gets to a point where you cannot be saying stuff like, I'm just scared, like, or if you're a girl, I'm just a girl, because it is literally costing you your obedience. It is, for some of you guys, it has cost you your legacy, your inheritance, as is the case for Saul, where it cost him his legacy, it cost him his place on the throne, because he saw himself as small in his own eyes. And now we see him moving mad when it came to David. And this notion of the eye is, again, when I was preparing, I think it's so evident in Matthew 6, where Jesus says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. And this is such an interesting statement, because Jesus is talking about perception and how you see determines how you move. If you are filled with light, you will see well. Your whole body will be full of light. You will see well. You will move well. If your eye is healthy, if your perception is rightly ordered, your whole body is full of light. In other words, clarity in vision produces clarity in movement. And I think that matters deeply when we start talking about identity and calling, because if you receive wrong information about yourself, you will move accordingly. You will move as Saul did, or as in the next story, in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, as the wicked servant moved. Now, in this story, a master entrusts his servants with different amounts with different amounts effectively. So one receives 5 talents, one receives 2 talents, and one receives 1 talent. And the text says that he distributed these according to their ability, effectively. Now, the master distributed these talents with the expectation that he'd receive a return on his investment. So a ROI, if you're into finance and all that good stuff. Two of the servants take what they were given and they invest it. They steward it, they multiply it. And that talents here are symbolic of your gifts and your skills. I'm not really talking about money here. I'm talking about the gifts and the skills you've been given by the grace of God, because it's a grace that you've been given. The last servant decides to hide the talent, the 1 talent he has. He decides to hide it and bury it. And when the master asks the servant, why did you do this? He says, I was afraid. And again, the issue is not only fear, but also perception. The servant goes on to explain that he saw the master as a hard man, as a harsh man. In other words, his fear was connected to how he perceived the character of the one who entrusted him. And so I think this is what I'm trying to get at. Not only does the fear of visibility and the fear of perception highlight a unhealthy perception of self, it also highlights an unhealthy perception of who God is as the one who has given you good gifts. Because the servant saw the master as wicked, he was afraid, and it kind of paralyzed him, and it caused him to hide the 1 talent that he had. And so I think I want to highlight how distorted self-perception, coupled with distorted God perception, how we perceive God, came together and resulted in this individual's paralysis. Perhaps he, the servant, the wicked servant, perhaps he thought, I'm not as competent as the others with the 5 or 2 talents. Perhaps he was caught up in comparison and jealousy. Perhaps he didn't feel as though, he was able to do a good enough job. Whatever it was that he had, coupled with his view of God as being harsh, resulted in him burying a talent as opposed to him multiplying what he had. Now, another thing I want to explore is this notion of imagining ourselves as the individual with the 1 talent. And I kind of explored this with the story of David, where a lot of us like to think of ourselves as David and not Saul, in the story of Saul and David. And I made a video on this just from a theological standpoint of how I think when we read the Bible, I don't think we should really be superimposing ourselves into the stories of the characters. I.e. When we think of the story of David and Goliath, I think a lot of us seem to think, well, we were taught that, we need to be strong like David and we're courageous like David and blah, 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 blah. But what if it's actually a typology of Christ? Christ being the unlikely servant who defeats Goliath, the enemy, on behalf of Israel, and how David was also an unlikely individual who kills this giant. And so that's a tangent, and I may explore that, but I kind of want to draw a parallel here where a lot of us seem to think that we are the faithful servants with the 10 talents, with the 5 talents, sorry. Is it 5 or 10 talents? With the many talents, basically. And we're not the servant with the 1 talent. And what if we are? I want to really posit to you, what if you are the one with the 1 talent? And that's not even a bad thing, because everyone was given according to their ability. Everyone was given it according to grace. And so the issue isn't really giftedness, or the lack of giftedness, I should say, and the lack of talent. Rather, I think it's about a refusal to steward what has already been entrusted to us, because fear feels safer than visibility and perception. And it's so sad to say that many Christians find more solace in fear than in obedience to God and in God himself. So what if you're not unqualified, you've just buried your talent? I want to hammer home this point, how all of this stems from a poor vision and a poor perception of self and a poor perception of God. Knowledge of self is not divorced from knowledge of God. Therefore, if your knowledge of God is faulty, your knowledge of self will be faulty, because we understand ourselves by virtue of knowing God. We don't understand ourselves in isolation from God, if that makes sense. So if I know that, for example, if I know that God is a God who is, I don't know, holy, I know that that's something I must emulate in my life. If I think God is wishy-washy about his moral standards, I will live a wishy-washy life in terms of morally speaking, if that makes sense. I was speaking to an American last year about this, and I just asked her, like, because with her, she is an influencer, like, she is textbook definition influencer, like, really strong following on social media. I think she's on like 30K or something like that. And I just asked her, like, genuinely speaking, like, how do you do it? Because I feel like British people could never, like, the thought of like posting consistently, like, I gag at the thought of posting once a week. Like, I just feel like, oh my gosh, like, everyone has just seen my entire life. Like, I've just revealed my whole nyash to the world. But I asked, like, how do you do it? Because you post so consistently. Like, I'll take a content for her. Like, I was very happy behind the camera. And she just said to me, like, I have the end goal. Like, the end goal in mind, the outcome in mind is greater than the temporary discomfort of people's opinions and people's thoughts. And for her, the end goal is the bag. And I think for us, the end goal should be hearing, well done, my good and faithful servant, at the end. That should mean more to us than a temporary discomfort of, are people going to think I'm cringe? Are people going to think I'm doing too much? Do people like the way that I sound? Do I look alright? Like, all of those temporary, fleeting thoughts. And so I say all of that to say, I think not only do I want us to really kind of realise that it gets to a point, yeah, where, and I don't know why I keep saying this, it's not cute anymore. Like, life asks more of you. We're fully vaccinated, got all your shots, and responsibility is, you know, demanding of you to show up. Calling is knocking at your door and is asking you to show up, whether that be to show up online, whether that be to use your voice, whether that be to dance, to launch your business, whatever it is. Purpose is knocking at your door, and eventually obedience comes, and the question changes. The question is no longer simply, why am I like this? The question becomes, will I allow this to continue costing me what God is asking of me? Because there comes a point where staying small is not cute anymore. It's actually quite costly. And I think another thing I want to also highlight is, who do you worship? Because I didn't think I would go down this path, but here we are. Who do you worship? Because if the fear of man is such a snare to you, if the opinions of man is such a snare to you, it makes me then wonder and question whose voice matters most to you. You give your obedience, your allegiance to that which you revere, to that which you esteem and reverence. And if anything, I think the fear of visibility, because, you know, of the opinions of man and other things pertaining to man, highlights to me that you've idolized man more so than you have, you know, pedestalized God. God is here, man is here. And as the Bible says, fear the one who can destroy both body and soul. Like, there's not much man can do to me. It scares me more knowing that God has my fate concerning my eternity and can destroy both my body and soul than it does people's fleeting opinions about me. People will talk, people will, you know, misinterpret you, people will judge irrespective of whether you do good or bad. Like, Jesus was, you know, perfect man, walked this earth, and people still had something bad to say about him. Like, that is unavoidable. But it really makes me think, you know, who do you worship? Do you worship man more than you worship God? And so that's why this conversation matters to me. I think I started off this podcast, transparently speaking, thinking this was just about fear. Now, come to the end of it, I've come to realize this is a matter of worship. Because the thing that you esteem, the thing that you fixate on, dictates how you conduct your life. And if the fear of visibility, which is tied to the fear of man, and even a poor self-perception, which, you know, maybe because, you know, you've internalized your own internal beliefs about yourself, whatever it may be, but somewhere along the way, it becomes a worship issue. It becomes an issue where you esteem perhaps your own opinion about yourself more than you do God's opinion. You esteem the opinions of man above God's opinion about you. And by virtue of that, you orient your life around that. And so it doesn't just become a rebellion, witchcraft issue. It becomes a worship issue where your life does not reflect, that your life does not orient around God and what he has commanded you to do. Jesus is no longer Lord of your life. It is man who dictates and is Lord over your life, lowercase l. So what am I learning from all of this? And I think the main thing is that doing this podcast is an act of worship. Now, I know that worship, we often think about worship being about the riffs, the runs, the vibrato, and the falsetto, and all that good stuff. But worship at its core is literally just about obedience and just giving God our best. And I think this is one of those cases where, I may have my own personal opinions about the podcast. Like, this is out of my comfort zone. Like, as I said before, like, I don't have Josh to hide behind, but it's an act of obedience. And by virtue of it being an act of obedience, it's an act of worship. I think what I'm also learning is this notion of like perception being powerful, but not it being ultimate. People always interpret you. Sometimes they will interpret you correctly, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll project onto you, sometimes they'll misunderstand you. That's uncomfortable, yes, but trying to control all of that is exhausting and ultimately impossible. I'm also learning that some of what I thought was my personality, like I don't like being in front of the camera, I don't like being in front of the microphone, it's just behavioural conditioning. Like, I am fine in front of the camera, it's just over time I've been chipped at, and it has inhibited my ability to really show up as my full and authentic self. I've, in previous seasons, preferred to default to the familiar rather than stepping out of my comfort zone. Thirdly, I'm learning that using your voice will always involve vulnerability. There's no version of speaking truthfully that allows you to remain completely protected from other people's perceptions. That does not exist. Once you speak, you're exposed. Once you share, you're interpretable. And that is precisely why courage is necessary, not because you're fierce, but because voice requires exposure. And I think final thing I want to perhaps highlight is seeing rightly, and how a poor perception of self, a poor vision, a poor sight can really keep you in bondage and keep you bound to disobedience. It can really keep you in a place where you're not fulfilling your full potential because the way you see God is faulty, or the way you see yourself is faulty. And more times, if the way you see yourself is faulty, the way you see God is faulty, because they're, as I mentioned before, linked. So this notion that perception is really powerful, it really determines how you move. And so if you are battling fear of visibility and fear of perception, really reflecting on, number one, your life of worship. And again, I'm not talking about the songs you sing, but your level of obedience in your life. Have you fully submitted everything to God? Who do you worship? Do you worship man more than you do God? Are you more obedient to the voice of man? Have you idolized man? Have you pedestalized man? And finally, I'd also encourage you to kind of get to a place where we don't sentimentalize traits like shyness or fear in particular. Let your fear draw you out of fear. I.E. Let your fear of God pull you out of the fear of man. Using your voice will always involve risk. When you speak, people will interpret your words. Some will misunderstand you and some will disagree. But the alternative, remaining silent in order to control perception, comes with its own cost. Because if you spend your life hiding behind the fence you built as a child, as I did, you may never step fully into the responsibilities and opportunities that adulthood brings. And I also want to extend that point. If you were a child watching this, because I feel like I get quite a few of my kids from Sunday school watching this, I don't want you just to think about this, I don't want you just to compartmentalize this to adulthood. If the fear of perception is something that you battle with now, and you've been called to do certain things, don't put it off into adulthood and say, when I'm an adult, that's when I'm going to walk in my full authority and in full confidence, because the Spirit is given to both the young and the old. There's no junior Holy Spirit, and so you also have the opportunity to walk in full confidence and boldness. And so when I say this, I'm also speaking to you. Don't allow childish tendencies to pull you back and to keep you bound when you're meant to be doing, speaking to your friend about Christ, or using your voice more, or dancing more, whatever it is. If you know that's what God is calling you to do and you have that conviction, step out into it and put away childish tendencies. There will come a point where you have to ask yourself a difficult question, which is the discomfort of being perceived a sufficient reason to remain silent? So I think that's why I want to leave this episode. Not with the claim that I've mastered this, not with the claim that fear has gone away, but with the recognition that my relationship with fear has changed. From the first time you saw me on the podcast on Evergreen to now, I think the key difference that has resulted in this shift in how I engage and relate with fear is a growth in my obedience. And that's not to say that you're not obedient if you feel fear, but you still, you still act and move. I still feel like, that's still a sign of obedience. But I think if anything, there's a willingness and a readiness now to fully submit myself to God, even if it makes me feel uncomfortable. It could be my frontal lobe just not caring about people's opinions more, which I fully acknowledge. But also I think it's an element of, I think I've grown in my obedience. I think I've grown in my worship. I think I fear God more. I think my perception of God has changed. I think I have pedestalized God more. Like I've magnified him in my imagination, in my mind. And as a result, it has resulted in me wanting to be more obedient, wanting to not walk in delayed disobedience as often as I did before, and wanting to act as quickly as possible when he instructs me to do something. And I think sometimes we forget as well that we're not doing God a privilege when it comes to serving him and showing up, and being obedient to him when it comes to using our gifts and our talents. It is a privilege. God doesn't need me. He really doesn't. I'm not bigger than the game. I'm not bigger than the program. It is a privilege. It's a privilege to sit down with God and to ask him, God, what is your vision for this podcast in my case? And in your case, it might be, God, what is your vision for this ministry? What is your vision for this dance ministry, for this network? What is your vision for this clothing brand? What is your vision for, this business or whatever it may be? What is your vision? It is a privilege. It just reminds me of just kind of like Adam and how God, God created all of the animals and he invited Adam into this place of relationship and said to him, you name the animals. And I think that's what we get the same opportunity now as well, where God has an image and an idea of what he wants to release onto the earth, and he looks for a willing and open vessel, and he wakes up in the night, or he picks on you and he knocks on your door, and he's inviting you to dialogue and conversation, to dream together and to execute what it is he has for his people, for the earth, for the nations, for whoever it is that he's seeking to target. It's a huge privilege. So I will leave that episode there. As always, comment, like and subscribe. I'm getting used to saying all of that. It's a mouthful. And if anything stood out to you, feel free to drop it in the comments. I hope that this episode really challenged you to fundamentally live a life of worship. Be obedient. If God is calling to do something, do it. Don't wait around, don't delay it. There's a story, and I'm going to finish with this. I read on Instagram where, I'm definitely butchering the story, but in short, this woman, basically, God had given her this idea to start up an NGO, gave her the name, everything, like down to a T. But for some reason, she just didn't execute. I think she was just prolonging the process. And long story short, she then eventually goes to this event or this conference, whatever, and someone gets called out mid-conference and verbatim is told to execute the NGO that this girl had been given. Down to the name, the mission statement, everything. It was just passed on to this other individual, and I think she ran with it. I think the NGO did extremely well. I think it just kind of goes to show, your ideas, they can actually go just like that. You may think, I've got time to execute it or whatever, but in actuality, that may not be the case. God forbid you're like this lady in question who thought she had all the time in the world, and everything that had been downloaded to her privately was given to someone else publicly. And so you can say, that was my idea first, because you received that revelation in private. It's not been given publicly to this other individual. I think the lady even turned to her friend in that moment and said, that I was literally given that idea. So yeah, I suppose the ending of this is no one's bigger than the program. You can all be fired. Lol. And just be obedient, guys. That's the most important part. I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.